Well, Bloor Street, I am very pleased and proud to introduce my cousin, John Sewell, to all of you. I think anybody who's lived in Toronto for the last 50 years will at least know John's name. He's been both a politician and an activist, I think, all his life. Not quite a politician all his life, but he started in the 70s as alderman of Ward 7, and he was an alderman with Karl Jaffary. And I am really, really sorry that Karl was not able to tune in with us today. And maybe if some of you are at Christie Gardens can tell Karl about this. John went on to be elected mayor in 1978 and has always been an activist in, I think, at least 3 big areas. The first one was the environment. John was one of the first environmentalists. He rode his bicycle or walked all over the city. He's been a vocal advocate for housing, and I think it's fair to say that most of the low rental housing in Toronto is because of John. And the third big interest of John's, and the reason that he's here with us today, is policing. And he's written a book about policing. He's taught courses at Ryerson and York on policing, and has always been an important part of the Toronto Police Accountability Coalition. So the Social Justice Committee thought that they would invite John because policing seems to be such a big issue in the city right now. We asked John to give us his insights about it, and particularly to talk a bit about defunding. So John, a very warm welcome to Bloor Street. We're looking forward to what you're going to say, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Mary.
And John, I'm just going to jump in here quickly. Sorry about that. We didn't mute people, so I am going to actually just mute everybody, and then I will unmute you again, John, and off we go. Okay, so we're just going to click on mute all, and then I will unmute you and let you know when we're ready to go. So just one moment, please. Okay, John, I think I've asked you to be unmuted. There you go. And you are on. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mary. I'm very happy to be back at Bloor Street United. I will say when I was mayor, I got to give a sermon at Bloor Street United on policing, of all things. I was in trouble at that point because I had defended a member of the Black community, Albert Johnson, who'd been shot and killed in his own home by the police. He was mentally ill, and I'd said that, in fact, we had to change the way policing worked in Toronto, so this never happened again. That was 41 years ago. So here I am returning. There's a lot to talk about. I'm gonna sort of rush through a series of 10 slides, and then we can certainly have some questions. The first one I want to show is just want to give you an idea about crime in Canada. As you can see, the high point in crime in Canada was about 30 years ago in the early 1990s. And since then, it has been declining very, very much. The Statistics Canada produces a thing called the Crime Severity Index, where they look at what we call severe crime. That would be crimes of violence of various kinds. So it's the more serious kinds of crime that happen. Like small theft would not be included, this and so forth. And you can see the data. In Canada in 2001, it stood at 105. 2 years ago, it stood at 75. So a good decrease. And it's even better in terms of youth. In youth, it was 105 in 2001. It's now down to 55. So crime in terms of youth has decreased by about a half in the last 20 years. And it's very interesting to look at that crime severity index in different cities in Canada. And I've shown that index on the left-hand side of the screen. Regina at 126. It's the most crime-laden city in Canada, followed by Winnipeg, followed by Edmonton and Thunder Bay. Look at Toronto. Toronto's at the very bottom. We have the least severe crime of any city in Canada outside of Quebec City. Quebec City is a bit lower than that. So we're living in a very, very safe city. The chart, the column on the right shows the number of police per 100,000 population. And I wanted to show that because the number of police bears absolutely no relationship to the level of crime that's happening. You can see as an example that Regina has 171 officers per 100,000 population with that very high crime severity index. Toronto has 167 at a very low crime index. So there's literally no relationship between crime and the number of police. How do police spend their time? I think this is very, very interesting information. In Toronto last year, about 27,000 people were charged with a criminal offense. Since we have about 5,000 officers, it means that each officer charged less than 6 people per year with a crime. In other words, only once every 2 months did an officer charge someone with a crime. And of those, only one of those 6 people was charged with a crime of violence. So this idea that the police are really dealing with a lot of crime, it's simply not true. It's a very, very limited amount of crime that they're dealing with at the end of the day. Another thing they do is they obviously respond to calls for service. And last year, they responded to just over 400,000 calls for service. The police received about double that number, but half the calls that weren't worth responding to for various reasons. And then if you look at that, where each officer works about 220 shifts per year, and there's 5,000 officers, it means that each officer is responding to about 1 call per shift. Pretty amazing data, right? Because you tend to think they're running around everywhere, but in fact, this is police data and it's not borne out. And in fact, the average amount of time they spend in each call is less than 90 minutes. So it makes you start to wonder, well, you know, what's really going on here? What are they really doing? In terms of moving traffic violations, you've probably read about this in the paper. The police have substantially reduced the number of tickets that they give to people for moving violations. 10 years ago, it was about 13,700 speeding tickets a month, whereas 2 years ago, it was down to 3,700 a month. You know, one of the things that I think we really need to do is do a really good, serious study about how it is that police spend their time. You know, let's get some students out there working under some experts to actually sort out what they're doing. The last time this was done in Canada was in 1977, almost 50 years ago in Peel Region. And it confirmed this kind of information, that there hasn't been much change. And just wanted to give you something about cost. An officer is paid $100,000 after being on the job for 5 years. So it's a good rate of pay. And of course, there's very heavy benefits on top of that as well. It's not inexpensive to run a policing service. I might say that that data is about comparable throughout the country. The very interesting study done in Kansas City in 1978 about patrol. They say that about 2/3 of police officers are involved in patrol at any one time. That's how most of them are allocated. And what they did in Kansas City is they took 3 areas and they compared them both before and after the experiment. In one, they just maintained the regular patrols that they'd always done. That would be about, say, once every hour in every street. On a second area, they doubled the number of patrols, so not once an hour, but once every half hour. And then in the third area, they had no patrols at all. They only responded to calls for service. What's fascinating is that they found at the end of the study that, first of all, there was absolutely no change in the crime rate in any of the three areas. Didn't matter how many patrols you had, it didn't affect the rate of crime at all. And secondly, it didn't affect the way the public felt about safety. They felt no more safe with the double the number of patrols as with no patrols. So this idea that in fact, having police visible means that people are going to feel safe, that study seems to say that's not the case. Unfortunately, in fact, patrols have never stopped. Police continue to do patrols. And you think, wow, the fire department used to do patrols. They'd go out and patrol for fires, but they stopped that about 100 years ago. They thought it was much more sensible to be in a station and wait for a call. After that, there was the policing authorities began to say, whoa, what are we going to do now? And they worked on this theory of broken windows, that if you could stop minor crime, that would stop serious crime. And that led to the idea in many cities in North America of the police stopping and searching anyone they thought looked suspicious and charging them with lesser crimes that they could find. In Canada, we called this carding. In the United States, they called it stop and search. And what the data showed in Toronto is that if you were a Black youth, you were probably stopped 4 or 5 times more often than if you happened to be white. So it's very, very heavily discriminatory. And I'm happy to say the provincial government banned carding in 2016. However, the discrimination has not stopped. The Ontario Human Rights Commission just came out with a study last month, which looked at the police laying charges in what you'd call discretionary issues. These are minor crimes, such as obstructing justice or uttering threats against the police or cannabis possession, or out-of-sight driving offenses. That is where you don't find that there's an offense until the police have stopped you. And then they say, ha, you did this. Now that I've stopped you, I found this. And what this study found, was that if you were Black, you were charged with almost 4 times as more offenses than people who were white. Very, very discriminatory. And what is interesting is that when these cases got to court, Blacks were less likely to be convicted than whites. So in other words, the charges against Blacks did not stand up in court. And even more remarkable, only 20% of the charges resulted in convictions. So there's a lot of serious systemic discrimination that's happening here in policing. And it's clearly something that has to change. Police do calls for people who are in mental crisis. As we know, police are trained to command and control when they come to a situation. Come in it and they try and take charge. When they try and take charge for someone who's in a mental crisis, the person often reacts in a very, very worrisome way. And as we know, the police pull out a gun and the person often can be killed. It's a big, big issue. Toronto has a mobile crisis intervention unit, which is a plainclothes officer and a mental health nurse, which is a very good intervention. The problem is that they are not first responders. So it's the officers who've got the guns who are the first responders, and it's not until they think they've got the situation under control that they can bring in someone from the mobile crisis intervention team. So the police have got it backwards, and they've always refused to change that. City Council wants to take that function away from the police and give it to a civilian agency. And they want to do the same with calls involving people who are homeless or people who are involved with drugs, since they say those things don't in any way respond to issues of crime. I want to touch very briefly on the question of police use of guns. Every officer has a gun, a semi-automatic pistol. In 2018, it was fired 17 times. Of those 17 times, 3 involved shooting someone who was armed. 3 were accidental, one of which very seriously injured a teenager. And the other 11 were to deal with a suffering animal. And last year, it was only fired 7 times. So the point is that guns are hardly ever used. And you have to ask the question, well, why don't we just take guns away from the officers? Just leave them with the emergency task force. There are a number of police forces where general officers are not armed. Britain, Ireland, Norway, Iceland, New Zealand. And police there say they feel much safer if they don't have guns, and that most situations can be handled without needing a gun. And if there is a problem, they phone the emergency task force. And you think, maybe that's something we could do. Police in Canada kill about 25 people a year, mostly with guns. In the US, it's 100 a month. The US is a very, very violent society, as we know. And here's the interesting figure. In Britain, since 1900, the police have killed 50 people. So that's 120 years, and they've killed 50 people. And last year, the police responded to over 3,000 calls involving a gun, and they never fired a shot. So it's a different idea of policing. As they say in Britain, it's policing by consent. Interesting change we could think of. Last point is about 2 officers in a car. This has been a rule in Toronto since 1977. It means that after dark in Toronto, there have to be 2 officers in a car. Most calls don't require 2 officers. You only need 1 officer. If you need another, hey, send out another car. Is it safer to have 2 officers? The data seems to say no, that if there's 2 officers in the car, they seem to take more chances than if there's only 1. Toronto is one of the few large police forces in Canada that still has this rule of 2 officers in a car. And if you're trying to save money in Toronto, if you abandoned that and got rid of that principle of 2 officers in a car, you could probably save about $50 million a year. So when people talk about defunding police, there's a simple way of doing it. It'll provide just as good service at a lot less money. I know that $50 million is not a lot when the police spend $1 billion, but it's a start. I want to deal very simply with recruitment, because this, I think, is a serious problem with police. Police work on a system that's fundamentally different than every other organization that exists in Canada, where if you want to be a member of the police force, you have to start at the bottom as a recruit. Imagine if you wanted to work in a hospital as a doctor and you had to start as an orderly and work your way up to be a nurse, and then a doctor's assistant, and then a doctor. It would be crazy. We would all think this is, but that's what you have to do if you want to be a police officer. You happen to be a good investigator working for an insurance company, and you know how to investigate things, and you think, boy, I could be a really useful detective. You would have to start as a recruit at the very, very bottom. And you'd apply. The senior officer would figure out whether you're going to fit in with the organization. And if you don't, if they think so, they won't accept you. They don't care whether you have any special skills or any experience. You have to be trained for 3 months in an isolated facility in Aylmer, Ontario. And you learn about police procedures, a lot of gun training, a lot of following orders in drill, so forth. And you learn police culture there. And what's amazing about this recruitment procedure is that once you become a police officer, they think you're going to need some special training. So you get time off work to get specially trained in certain areas. So it's a really weird way of actually doing things. It would be much smarter to do things the way most other organizations do, which is you have a job description, you put it out there, you hire anybody from anywhere if they've got the skills that you need. That would also manage to break down police culture. I have 2 other slides left, and then I'll stop. One is about managers. Managers in police are only hired from within, not from the outside. And as you can imagine, you start as a recruit, you don't have any management experience, you somehow are going to pick that up within the organization, and then you get recruited up to be a manager. It's a very strange way of doing things. They never seek good managers from outside. They think that, in fact, understanding police culture trumps any management ability. In Toronto, we're now looking for a new chief. Toronto has never hired a chief that has not worked for the Toronto Police Force. And I expect that might be the same thing again, that nobody's good enough to work for Toronto Police unless they've been a Toronto police officer. I think it would be terrific if they went and found a really good manager from a bank, because managers are really good at managing, and put them into a good senior position with the police. If you wanted to have a new agenda for policing, here are some ideas. One is pre-charge screening. This is where if an officer is going to lay a charge in a discretionary matter, they have to get it approved by a Crown attorney. They do this in Quebec, they do it in British Columbia. It's a good way of making sure that police are not discriminating, particularly against Blacks and Indigenous and people of color. We could easily do that here, just as they've done it in 2 other provinces. We could talk about disarming frontline officers and limiting guns to emergency task force. It would make society a lot safer. We could fill up positions by open competition rather than using the recruit model. We could begin to hire managers from outside policing. We could take mental crisis calls, homeless calls, drug overdose calls from the police and provide them through civilian agencies. And you only phone the police when, in fact, you actually need somebody there to deal with issues of violence. I think we need an intensive study of how police spend their time, and we should end the rule of 2 officers in a car after dark. Good. I've gone way over my time. I better stop. But I'm delighted to have any questions.
John, thank you very much. You actually kept very closely to time because we started a little bit late.